They should have been dust. Atoms scattered across the void. A cautionary tale whispered among the stars about what happens when lesser beings dare to dream above their station. The Tau Empire, young, naive, impossibly fragile, had committed the ultimate transgression in a galaxy that does not forgive. They had expanded, they had thrived. They had dared to offer hope in a universe built on endless suffering. And the Imperium of Man, that vast grinding machine of a million worlds, had noticed. When humanity's gaze falls upon you in the 41st millennium, extinction usually follows. It's not personal, it's policy. So why do the Tau still draw breath? Why does their empire continue to grow while ancient civilizations crumble to dust? The answer is far more terrifying than any war the Tau have ever fought, because it reveals something profound about the true nature of survival in Warhammer 40,000. This is not a story of military genius or superior technology. This is a story about being too insignificant to bother killing until suddenly you're not. The year is roughly 742, M41, the Damocles Gulf campaign. This is the moment when the Imperium finally commits. No more local garrison forces. No more planetary defense fleets dealing with the blue-skinned upstarts. This time, the full weight of Imperial fury is about to crash down upon the Tau like a hammer upon glass. Battle fleets are assembled. Entire chapters of Space Marines are mobilized. The Adeptus Mechanicus brings forth war machines that haven't walked in centuries. This is the kind of force that reduces sectors to compliance. That burns entire alien civilizations from existence. That makes examples so brutal that surrounding species learn to bow before they're even asked. The Tau homeworld of Tau itself sits within reach, vulnerable, exposed. High Command has already begun drafting the Declaration of Extermination. In a universe where genocide is paperwork, the Tau's file is being processed. But here's what the Imperium doesn't realize yet. Here's what makes this particular war different from the 10,000 other genocide campaigns currently grinding through the galaxy. The Tau aren't just fighting for survival. They're fighting for something that hasn't existed in this galaxy for so long that most species have forgotten it ever could. They believe in progress, not the grim maintenance of ancient technology, not the desperate clinging to past glory. Actual progress, advancement, tomorrow being better than today. It's a concept so alien to the Imperium that they lack the vocabulary to truly comprehend it. And that philosophical difference is about to save the Tau in the most unexpected way imaginable. The invasion begins as expected. Imperial forces smash through outer colonies like a fist through parchment. Tau Firecast warriors, despite their sophisticated battlesuits and advanced weaponry, find themselves overwhelmed by sheer mass. For every Imperial guardsman that falls, 10 more march forward. For every tank destroyed, a dozen more grind over its wreckage. This is the Imperium's war doctrine distilled to its purest form. Throw enough bodies at the problem until the problem drowns in corpses. And it's working. Tau colonies burn. Their carefully planned cities become charnel houses. Evacuation fleets flee deeper into Tau space, carrying refugees and the growing realization that they might have finally met an enemy too vast to defeat. The Ethereals, those enigmatic leaders of Tau society, convene an emergency session. Some advocate for total mobilization. Others suggest diplomatic overtures, still clinging to the naive belief that reason might prevail. But one Ethereal, Anva, understands something the others don't. The Imperium cannot be negotiated with, cannot be reasoned with. It can only be survived. Then something happens that no one expects. Not the Imperium, not the Tau, not even the galaxy's most far-seeing prophets. A warp storm erupts. Not just any disturbance in that hellish dimension beyond reality. A massive roiling wound in space-time itself, tearing open between the Damocles Gulf and the Imperium's staging grounds. Supply lines vanish overnight. Reinforcement fleets find themselves cut off, drifting in the Immaterium's impossible currents. The vast Imperial war machine, that unstoppable juggernaut of conquest, suddenly finds itself starving. Without reinforcements, without resupply, without the endless stream of resources that makes imperial doctrine viable, the invasion begins to falter, not dramatically, not with any single decisive defeat, but slowly, inexorably, like a fire running out of fuel. And here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the narrative most people accept starts to crack around the edges. Because yes, the warp storm happened. Yes, it cut off Imperial supply lines. Yes, it forced a tactical withdrawal. But warp storms happen all the time in this galaxy. They disrupt campaigns constantly. They're an accepted hazard of waging war across the stars. The Imperium has protocols for dealing with them, contingencies, alternative routes. The Imperial Navy has navigated far worse than the Damocles Gulf disturbance. So why did they actually withdraw? Why did the administratum, those cold calculating bureaucrats who measure victory in acceptable loss ratios, decide that the Tau weren't worth the extended effort? After all, the Tau homeworld was right there, within striking distance. A few more months, maybe a year of campaign, and the entire species could have been erased. The Imperium has certainly committed to longer wars for lesser prizes. The official record blames the warp storm. The tactical assessments cite supply difficulties. The after-action reports speak of acceptable disengagement and resource reallocation. But tucked away in restricted archives, in documents sealed behind clearance levels that most Imperial citizens don't even know exist, there's a different story. A calculation. A cold, brutal assessment made by minds that think in terms of galactic strategy rather than single conflicts. The Tau weren't worth exterminating. Not because they weren't dangerous, not because they didn't deserve it, but because at that exact moment in Imperial history, there were bigger threats. The 13th Black Crusade was building momentum on the edge of the Eye of Terror. Tyranid hive fleets were beginning their invasion in earnest. Necron tomb worlds were awakening after millions of years of slumber. And somewhere in High Command's labyrinthine strategic planning, someone made a choice. The resources required to completely exterminate the Tau could be better spent elsewhere. Let them have their little empire for now. Let them believe they've earned their survival through military prowess. Because in the grand calculus of Imperial power, the Tau were a footnote, an irritation, a problem that could wait. But problems that wait have this funny habit in the Warhammer galaxy. They tend to grow. And the Tau, with their belief in progress, with their willingness to adapt and evolve, were about to become something the Imperium couldn't have predicted. Something far more dangerous than just another alien species to be crushed. They were about to become an ideology. And you can't kill an ideology with guns alone. The Imperium strategists had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed the Tau would remain static. That like every other species in the galaxy, the Tau would reach a plateau of development and stay there, forever locked at whatever technological and philosophical level they'd achieved. It's what happened to everyone else after all. Humanity peaked during the Dark Age of technology and has spent 10,000 years slowly forgetting how their own machines work. The Eldar reached the apex of their civilization and promptly birthed a chaos god through their own decadence. Even the orcs, for all their savage vitality, are just pale shadows of the ancient Krork who once fought gods and won. Stagnation is the galaxy's natural state. Entropy dressed up as stability. But the Tau didn't read that script. Within decades of the Damocles Gulf campaign, Tau society underwent transformations that would have taken the Imperium millennia to even contemplate. They studied every engagement, every defeat, every near-extinction moment. They didn't cling to tradition. They didn't venerate ancient battle doctrines because some honored ancestor had written them down. They learned. They adapted. They changed. The Firecast analyzed Imperial tactics and developed countermeasures. The Earthcast reverse-engineered captured technology and improved upon it. The Watercast observed how the Imperium's propaganda worked and crafted their own message of the greater good. And the Ethereals, Those mysterious figures whose very existence raises questions that make inquisitors uncomfortable. They orchestrated it all with a patience that seemed almost inhuman. New battlesuits rolled off production lines, each generation more sophisticated than the last. The hammerhead gunships became sleeker, deadlier. Rail rifle technology advanced to the point where Tau infantry could punch through Space Marine armor at ranges that made close combat irrelevant. But the real evolution wasn't technological. It was philosophical. The Tau looked at the galaxy around them and saw something the Imperium had long since forgotten to see. Potential allies, not servants. Not conquered subjects forced into compliance. Actual allies. The Kroot, those savage carnivorous warriors, became partners rather than mercenaries. The Vespid crystalline insectoid beings contributed their unique capabilities to the greater good. Even human worlds, those farthest from Terra's light, began to listen when Tau diplomats arrived offering something the Imperium never could. A choice. Join us willingly, the Tau said. Keep your culture. Keep your identity. Just accept that cooperation benefits everyone more than endless war. It was a message that shouldn't have worked. This galaxy runs on blood and suffering. Peace is the anomaly. War is the natural state. And yet, slowly, impossibly, the Tau sphere of influence began to grow. Not through conquest alone, but through conversion. Through hope. Through the radical concept that maybe, just maybe, things could be better. And that's when the Imperium realized what they were actually facing. This wasn't just another alien empire to be crushed. This was an existential threat to everything the Imperium represented. Because if the Tau were right, if cooperation and progress were actually possible, then what did that say about humanity's choice? What did it say about 10,000 years of suffering and sacrifice and endless war? The Imperium's entire civilization is built on a foundation of necessary evil. They torture because they must. They oppress because there's no alternative. They burn entire worlds because the galaxy is too dark, too hostile, too fundamentally broken for mercy to exist. It's a grim calculus, but it's the calculus that lets Imperial citizens sleep at night. We do terrible things because terrible things must be done. But the Tau, impossibly young and naive, were offering a different equation. And people were listening. High Command convened again. More assessments. More strategic projections. The Tau had expanded beyond their original projections. They were recruiting Imperial worlds, spreading their ideology like a virus. The threat matrix was recalculated, and suddenly, the Tau weren't a footnote anymore. They were a problem that demanded a solution, a permanent solution. The kind the Imperium excels at, except now there was a complication. The Tau had learned from Damocles. They'd fortified their borders, established defensive networks that would make a direct assault costly. More importantly, they'd scattered. No longer was there a single homeworld to target, one decisive blow to decapitate the Empire. The Tau had spread their command structure, diversified their industrial base, created redundancies that made total extermination impractical. They'd studied how the Imperium destroyed species and engineered their society to survive it. It was adaptation at a speed that shouldn't have been possible. And it terrified certain elements within the Imperial hierarchy more than any Tyranid swarm or chaos incursion ever could. But there's another layer to this. Another reason the Tau survived that goes deeper than military capability or strategic planning. It's uncomfortable. It's rarely discussed in official Imperial doctrine, but it's true nonetheless. The Tau are useful, not to the Imperium as a whole, but to specific factions within it. Rogue traders find them reliable trading partners. Certain Forge worlds appreciate their technological insights. Even some Inquisitors have discovered that the Tau can be pointed at mutual enemies with surprising effectiveness. There are wars where letting the Tau fight alongside Imperial forces makes tactical sense. Genestealer cults don't discriminate by species. Chaos corruption cares nothing for Empire boundaries. And when the alternative is calling in the exterminatus on your own worlds, Sometimes a temporary alliance with blue-skinned idealists starts to look appealing. So the Tau survive in this strange gray zone, too useful to completely destroy, too dangerous to ignore, too alien to truly trust, but too effective to waste. It's an uncomfortable balance, one that goes against everything the Imperium officially stands for. But the Imperium is vast enough to contain contradictions. Official policy says exterminate all Xenos. Practical reality says sometimes you need them. Then came the Great Rift, that catastrophic wound torn across the galaxy when Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade finally succeeded. When Cadia fell and the Imperium was literally split in two, reality itself buckled. Warp storms erupted everywhere. Half the galaxy found itself cut off from Terra's light, drowning in darkness as the forces of chaos poured forth. It should have been the Tau's end. Their empire sat on the wrong side of that divide, isolated, surrounded by nightmares older than their entire civilization. But again, they survived. Not through military might alone, not through technological superiority, through something the Imperium had forgotten was possible: unity of purpose. While human worlds descended into panic and civil war, while ancient alliances crumbled under the weight of isolation and fear, the Tau held together. The greater good, that philosophy the Imperium dismisses as naive propaganda, became their anchor. They didn't fracture, didn't turn on each other, didn't collapse into the chaos that consumed so many others. They endured. And more than that, they kept expanding. Even with the galaxy literally tearing itself apart, even with demons manifesting on worlds that had never known chaos, even with the Imperium's attention utterly consumed by its own survival, the Tau found opportunity. They recruited desperate human populations who saw the greater good as salvation. They forged alliances with minor Xeno species who understood that cooperation was the only path forward. They established new colonies, new industrial centers, new bastions of order in a galaxy drowning in madness. It shouldn't have worked. By every logical assessment, the Great Rift should have destroyed them. But logic, the Tau learned, is only as good as the assumptions it's built on. And the Imperium's assumptions about what species could and couldn't survive no longer applied. There's a moment, recorded in classified inquisitorial records, that encapsulates the entire Tau question. A conclave of inquisitors, some of the Imperium's most powerful and paranoid individuals, gathered to discuss the Tau problem once more. They had the resources, they had the authority. They could, with a single decree, redirect enough Imperial might to glass every Tau world simultaneously. The strategic assets existed. The political will could be manufactured. They could end the Tau, permanently, finally, and they chose not to. Not because they'd grown soft, not because they'd been corrupted or compromised, but because when they ran the numbers, when they looked at the galaxy as it actually existed, rather than how it should exist according to Imperial doctrine, they reached an unavoidable conclusion. The resources required to exterminate the Tau would leave critical sectors vulnerable to far worse threats. The manpower needed could be better spent holding back Tyranid invasions. The military assets had higher priority targets. And perhaps most damningly, the Tau were solving problems the Imperium couldn't. They were fighting chaos incursions on worlds the Imperium had written off. They were containing minor Xenos threats that would otherwise require Imperial intervention. They were, in the coldest possible calculation, more useful alive than dead. For now. That last part matters for now. Because the Imperium never forgets, never forgives. They might tolerate the Tau today because extinction is impractical. They might even cooperate when circumstances demand it, but they're keeping score. Every world the Tau convert. Every human who accepts the greater good. Every time the Tau prove that maybe, possibly, there's another way to survive in this nightmare galaxy. It all gets recorded, cataloged, added to a debt that will someday come due. The Imperium thinks in terms of millennia. They can be patient when patience serves their interests. And the Tau, for all their advancement, for all their success, have only existed for a handful of those millennia. They're still children by galactic standards, still learning that survival isn't the same as victory, still believing that because they've made it this far, they'll make it through whatever comes next. But the Imperium knows something the Tau haven't learned yet. In this galaxy, survival is never permanent. It's just a temporary stay of execution. What the Imperium doesn't advertise, what gets buried in archives so deep that even most Inquisitors never see them, is that they've tried, multiple times. The official narrative speaks of tactical withdrawals and resource reallocation, but the truth is far more disturbing. There have been 3 separate campaigns since Demicles specifically designed to end the Tau permanently. Each one was planned with meticulous detail. Each one had the resources, the personnel, the strategic positioning to succeed. And each one failed in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The first attempt came barely 50 years after Damocles. The Death Corps of Krieg, those remorseless trench warriors who measure their worth in acceptable casualties, were deployed alongside the Mortifactor's Space Marine chapter. The target was the Tau-Sept world of Phaeton, a critical industrial center whose destruction would cripple Tau production for decades. The Death Corps did what they always do. They ground forward with inhuman persistence, turning the planet's surface into a graveyard of trenches and artillery craters. They didn't care about losses. They never do. For every 10,000 Kriegsmen who died, 20,000 more marched into the meat grinder. It should have worked. The Tau don't have infinite numbers. They can't match the Imperium's willingness to spend lives like currency. But something happened that the Imperial commanders hadn't accounted for. The Tau didn't fight them conventionally. They evacuated the civilian population within weeks, stripped the industrial facilities of anything valuable, and then they waited. Let the Death Corps spend months, years conquering empty territory, burning cities that were already abandoned, claiming victory over ruins that held no strategic value. By the time the Imperium realized they'd been fighting a ghost, the Tau had rebuilt everything they'd lost on 3 different worlds simultaneously. The Death Corps had conquered nothing but dirt and corpses. They'd won the battle and lost the war in a way that their strategic doctrine couldn't even process. The second attempt was more insidious. The Inquisition deployed a carefully crafted plan of infiltration and internal collapse. If the Tau couldn't be beaten militarily, perhaps they could be destroyed from within. Agents were inserted into Tau society. Some were sleeper operatives, humans who'd spent years pretending to embrace the greater good. Others were more exotic, xeno-species that had joined the Tau Empire but remained loyal to Imperial coin. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Assassinate key ethereals, sabotage critical infrastructure, engineer conflicts between different Tau castes and their alien auxiliaries, make the Empire tear itself apart through manufactured crisis. And for a while, it was working. Ethereal Anshi survived 3 assassination attempts in as many months. Production facilities on 2 different Sept worlds experienced mysterious catastrophic failures. Kroot auxiliaries and Firecast warriors nearly came to open conflict over resource allocation disputes that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The Tau Empire teetered on the edge of internal collapse. And then it didn't, because the Watercast, those diplomatic manipulators that the Imperium consistently underestimates, did something unexpected. They found the agents. Not through superior intelligence gathering, not through advanced surveillance technology, but through philosophy. They simply talked to people, asked questions, listened to grievances, and discovered that manufactured conflicts feel different than organic ones. That artificial discord has a texture that genuine disagreement lacks. Within months, the entire infiltration network was exposed, not through torture or investigation, but through conversation. The captured agents were given a choice: accept the greater good genuinely, or be returned to the Imperium unharmed. Most chose to stay, not because they were brainwashed or coerced, but because for the first time in their lives, someone had asked them what they actually wanted. The Inquisition had never planned for that possibility. The third attempt is still classified at the highest levels, but fragments have emerged over the decades. This one involved the Adeptus Mechanicus and weapons that shouldn't exist outside of Dark Age legends, molecular destabilizers, nanophage protocols, technology so devastating that using it violated treaties the Mechanicus had with itself. The target was the Tau's ability to reproduce, a biological weapon specifically engineered to target Tau physiology, to render their entire species sterile within a single generation. No battles, no invasions. Just silence as the youngest species in the galaxy aged into extinction. The weapon was deployed. The Mechanicus confirmed dispersal across multiple sept worlds. Projections gave the Tau population 60 years before terminal collapse, and then nothing happened. The Tau kept reproducing. Their population growth continued exactly as before. Confused Mechanicus Magi analyzed the biological data and discovered something that made even their emotionless machine hearts pause. The Tau had already adapted. Their genetic structure had shifted, mutated, evolved in ways that should have taken millions of years, not through natural selection, not through planned genetic engineering, through something the Mechanicus couldn't explain and didn't want to acknowledge. The Tau were changing at a cellular level in response to existential threats. They were evolving in real time. It was impossible. It violated every principle of biology the Mechanicus understood. And it was happening anyway. That's when certain elements within the Imperium began asking different questions. Not how to destroy the Tau, but what the Tau actually were, because species don't evolve like that. Don't adapt with such perfect timing. Don't survive impossible odds through convenient intervention. There's a pattern here that looks uncomfortably familiar to those who know where to look. The Tau emerged from their homeworld precisely when the galaxy needed a new player. They survived their first encounters with the Imperium through a warp storm that appeared at the exact moment they needed it. They've adapted to every threat with suspicious precision. They spread their philosophy of unity and cooperation at the same time the galaxy is being torn apart by division and war. And their ethereal caste, those enigmatic leaders whose very presence induces loyalty and calm, possess abilities that the Tau themselves can't fully explain. There are inquisitors who've spent decades studying this pattern, who've compiled evidence that never quite proves anything but suggests everything. And their conclusion, whispered in chambers shielded from all surveillance, is absolutely terrifying. The Tau aren't surviving despite the galaxy's hostility. They're surviving because something wants them to. The question is what, and more importantly, why? Some theorize the Eldar are involved, that this is some labyrinthine scheme that won't reveal its purpose for another 10,000 years. Others suggest something darker, that the Chaos Gods themselves find the Tau's philosophy amusing and are protecting them as cosmic entertainment. The most paranoid whisper about ancient mechanisms left behind by the Old Ones, that perhaps the Tau are another experiment like the Eldar or the Orcs, designed for a purpose that hasn't yet manifested. But there's another possibility that keeps certain inquisitors awake despite neural conditioning that should prevent such weakness. What if the Tau are exactly what they appear to be? What if they're just a young species that's better at adaptation than anyone expected? What if their survival isn't evidence of manipulation, but proof that cooperation and progress actually work? Because if that's true, if the Tau genuinely represent a viable alternative to the Imperium's endless grinding horror, then what does that say about humanity's choices? What does it say about 10,000 years of suffering that maybe, possibly, didn't need to happen? That question is more dangerous than any weapon, more threatening than any invasion. Because the Imperium can survive military defeats, can endure losses that would break lesser civilizations, can weather storms that consume entire sectors. What it cannot survive is doubt. The moment Imperial citizens start wondering if there's another way, the moment they start questioning whether the suffering is truly necessary, the entire edifice begins to crumble. And the Tau, simply by existing, simply by proving that another path is possible. Plant that seed of doubt. Not through conquest, not through force, just through example. There's a recording, smuggled out of an imperial world, that felt a Tau expansion through diplomatic integration rather than military force. A guardsman, decorated veteran of 3 campaigns, standing before a Tau water-caste diplomat. The guardsman is angry, confused. He's asking why the Tau are here, what they want, why they didn't just invade if they wanted the planet. And the diplomat says something that the Imperium has no defense against. She says they want nothing except for people to be safe, to prosper, to have tomorrow be better than today. The guardsman asks what the catch is, what the hidden cost will be. And the diplomat looks genuinely sad as she explains there isn't one. That the greater good means exactly what it claims. That cooperation benefits everyone, and the Tau genuinely believe that. The recording ends with the guardsman crying. Not from fear or anger, but from the sudden realization of what he's been denied his entire life. Hope. Simple, basic hope that things could be better. The Imperium had trained him to die. The Tau offered him a reason to live, and he chose them. As did thousands of others on that world. Not because they were conquered, but because they were offered a choice and made it freely. That's the real reason the Tau should have been exterminated. Not because they're militarily dangerous. Not because they threaten Imperial territory. But because they threaten the fundamental narrative that makes the Imperium possible. They prove, every single day they survive, that the Imperium's way isn't the only way. That humanity's choice to embrace endless war and suffering wasn't inevitable. That maybe, in some other timeline, things could have been different. And that possibility, that tiny seed of hope in a galaxy that runs on despair, is the most dangerous thing the Tau possess. More dangerous than their railguns or battlesuits. More threatening than their expansion or their diplomacy. The idea that a better future is possible will outlive any empire and overthrow any regime. And the Tau made the critical mistake of proving it might be true. The Imperium's response to this existential threat was predictable in its brutality and terrifying in its scale. If the Tau couldn't be destroyed through conventional means, if they'd somehow adapted to every military, biological, and infiltration strategy deployed against them, then the solution was simple. Remove the option of choice entirely. The Ordo Xenos began implementing what they called the Quarantine Protocol. It started subtly. Imperial worlds near Tau space found their governors replaced with hardliners who'd been selected specifically for their ideological rigidity. Trade routes were rerouted. Communication channels were monitored with unprecedented scrutiny. Any citizen who expressed curiosity about the Tau, who asked questions about their society or philosophy, found themselves under investigation. Not arrested, not executed, just watched, just isolated, just reminded that some questions were dangerous to ask. The message was clear without ever being spoken aloud. The Tau exist, yes, but they exist over there, and you exist here. And that boundary is absolute. But boundaries are only as strong as the people enforcing them believe they need to be. And the Imperium, for all its vast power, for all its capacity for control, was discovering that ideas don't respect borders. On a mining world called Velker's Rest, 73 light years from the nearest Tau settlement, something impossible happened. The workers revolted. Not for better conditions or higher pay, though they certainly wanted those things. They revolted specifically demanding integration into the Tau Empire. They'd never met a Tau, never seen one in person. Their world had no contact with Tau space whatsoever. But they'd heard stories, whispers carried by traders, tales told by refugees from conquered worlds who spoke not of subjugation but of opportunity. And those stories had spread like fire through the underground mining communities. The planetary governor responded exactly as expected. He called in the Arbites, those brutal enforcers of imperial law. When the Arbites proved insufficient, he requisitioned guard regiments. Within a month, Velker's Rest was drowning in blood. 17,000 miners dead. their families executed for complicity. Entire hab blocks burned to ash to ensure the contamination didn't spread. The official reports listed it as a chaos cult uprising. The real reports, sealed behind inquisitorial clearance, told a different story. The miners had been chanting Tao philosophical principles as they died, shouting about the greater good, believing, genuinely believing, that they were sacrificing themselves for a better future. They'd made the Tao idea into a religion without ever meeting a single blue-skinned alien. That terrified the Ordo Xenos more than any military defeat could have, because you can't quarantine an idea. You can't build walls high enough to keep out hope. The Imperium had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of physical control, but they'd always relied on something deeper. The belief that their way was the only way, that suffering was necessary, that the alternative to imperial rule was chaos and extinction. The Tao weren't just offering an alternative. They were proving it could work. And that proof was spreading through imperial space like a virus for which no vaccine existed. More worlds began showing signs of infection. Not rebellions, not at first, just questions. Just citizens wondering aloud why things had to be the way they were. Just workers asking if maybe there was another path. And each question was a crack in the foundation. Each doubt was a weakness in the armor. The Imperium could crush 1 billion rebellions. What it couldn't crush was the slow erosion of absolute certainty. The Inquisition convened at the highest levels. Representatives from every Ordo gathered on a world whose name has been stricken from all records. They had before them a choice that would define the next 1,000 years of imperial policy. They could commit to total war against the Tau, redirect enough military assets to guarantee complete extermination regardless of cost. It would leave sectors vulnerable. It would cost trillions of lives. It would potentially doom humanity in other theaters of war. But it would eliminate the ideological threat permanently. Or they could adapt. Find a way to coexist with the Tau while containing their influence. It went against every principle the Imperium was built on. It meant acknowledging that perhaps, in some limited way, the Tau weren't entirely wrong. That cooperation could sometimes work. That the galaxy wasn't quite as black and white as Imperial doctrine claimed. The debate lasted for weeks. Inquisitors who'd spent centuries hunting Xenos argued passionately for extermination. Others, pragmatists who'd seen the galaxy's true complexity, advocated for a more nuanced approach. And in the end, they reached a decision that satisfied no one and horrified everyone. They would do both. The official policy remained unchanged. The Tau were Xenos. They were to be exterminated on sight. No negotiation. No quarter. Every Imperial citizen was taught from birth that the alien was to be hated and feared and destroyed. That doctrine would not change because doctrine was what held the Imperium together. But unofficially, in the shadows where inquisitors and rogue traders and pragmatic generals operated, there would be flexibility. The Tau could be used when necessary, could be tolerated when strategic considerations demanded it, could even be cooperated with when the alternative was worse. It was hypocrisy of the highest order. It was contradictory and unstable and philosophically indefensible. It was also the only path forward that the Imperium could see. They would maintain the lie that the Tau were nothing but vermin to be exterminated, while simultaneously using them as tools when convenient. They would preach absolute xenophobia while practicing selective pragmatism. And they would hope that Imperial citizens never noticed the contradiction, never asked why the Tau kept surviving despite supposedly being targeted for extinction, never wondered if maybe the propaganda wasn't quite as absolute as it claimed to be. But some did notice, some did ask. And those questions led to places that made the Inquisition deeply uncomfortable. There's a theory, never officially acknowledged but whispered among certain radical elements, that the Imperium needs the Tau, not in any military sense, not as allies or assets, but as a pressure valve, as proof that alternatives to imperial rule inevitably fail. See, the theory goes, if the Imperium actually exterminated the Tau, they'd lose their most visible example of why humanity's brutal methods are necessary. As long as the Tau exist, they can be pointed to whenever someone questions Imperial doctrine. Look at those naive aliens, the propagandists can say. Look how they struggle. How they're constantly besieged. How their empire remains small despite their grand ambitions. Isn't it obvious that cooperation and progress don't work in this galaxy? Isn't it clear that only the Imperium's might can truly protect humanity? But if the Tau were gone, if they were exterminated completely, then there'd be no living counterexample, no proof that the Imperium's way was the only way. And some radical elements began wondering if maybe, just maybe, that's why the Tau were really still alive. Not because they were too difficult to destroy, but because the Imperium needed them to exist so they could keep failing. Except the Tau weren't failing. Not in the way they were supposed to. Not fast enough. Not completely enough. They kept adapting, kept surviving, kept growing despite everything the galaxy threw at them. And that's when everything changed. Not through any single decisive event. Not through a battle or an assassination or a political upheaval. But through a quiet realization that spread through both empires simultaneously. The Imperium realized they couldn't destroy the Tau without destroying themselves in the process. And the Tau realized they couldn't expand indefinitely without eventually provoking a war they couldn't win. They'd reached a stalemate, not a formal one, not a peace treaty or ceasefire, just a mutual understanding that total war benefited neither side. The Imperium had bigger threats to worry about. The Tau had achieved enough breathing room to focus on internal development rather than desperate survival. And so they settled into an uneasy coexistence. Border skirmishes continued. Small-scale wars flared and died. Each side probed the other's defenses, tested for weakness, prepared for the day when circumstances might change. But the existential war, the war of total extermination, quietly faded into possibility rather than immediacy. It wasn't peace. It wasn't even really a truce. It was just both sides deciding that right now, at this moment, they had more important things to worry about. But here's what makes the situation so unstable, so pregnant with future catastrophe. Neither side has actually changed their fundamental position. The Imperium still believes the Tau must eventually be destroyed. That's not up for debate. It's just been postponed. Delayed until circumstances are more favorable. Until the Tyranids are dealt with. Until the Chaos incursions are contained. Until the Necrons go back to sleep. Until. The list of more pressing threats keeps growing. And the Tau keep slipping further down the priority list. But they're still on it. And the Tau, for their part, still believe in the greater good. Still think they can eventually convince humanity to join them. Still hold on to the hope that cooperation will triumph over conflict. They're willing to be patient. Willing to wait. Willing to prove through example that their way works. But they're not willing to submit. Not willing to accept that the Imperium's way is correct. Not willing to stop spreading their philosophy to anyone who'll listen. So you have two empires, locked in proximity, each fundamentally opposed to everything the other represents, each convinced that ultimately their philosophy will prevail, and each just patient enough to delay the final confrontation. It's not sustainable. It's a star on the edge of going supernova, a dam with cracks spreading through its foundation, pressure building in a sealed chamber with no release valve. And everyone knows it. The Ethereals know that someday the Imperium will come for them with total commitment. The Inquisition knows that someday the Tau's ideology will become too dangerous to tolerate. Both sides are preparing. Both sides are building strength. Both sides are waiting for the moment when the galaxy's circumstances shift just enough to make total war viable again. The question isn't if they'll fight to the end. The question is when. And what will be left of either of them when it's finally over. The moment of truth came not with thunder, but with silence. A single transmission intercepted by an inquisitorial monitoring station on the edge of Tau space. 5 words that made analysts forward the message up the chain of command with hands that trembled despite decades of conditioning. 5 words that reached the highest levels of the Inquisition within hours. 5 words that changed everything. We have found another one. Another Tau homeworld. Not Tau itself, but a second planet of origin. Hidden deep within their territory, shielded by layers of secrecy that even the Watercast rarely discussed. And the implications were staggering. Because if the Tau had 2 homeworlds, they might have 3, or 5, or 10. Every extermination scenario the Imperium had ever planned was built on a single assumption. Find the homeworld, destroy it, watch the Empire collapse. The Emperor's children had done it to the Lar. The Ultramarines had done it to countless species during the Great Crusade. It was doctrine. It was proven strategy. And it was completely useless if your enemy had scattered their origins across multiple worlds. The Tau hadn't just adapted to survive Imperial strategy. They'd evolved beyond it entirely. They'd made themselves unexterminable through redundancy, through dispersal, through the simple recognition that putting all your eggs in one basket was suicide in this galaxy. The Inquisitor who first read that message sat in silence for 3 hours, not out of shock, not out of fear, but out of something far more profound: respect. Grudging, unwanted, philosophically uncomfortable respect. The Tau had looked at the Imperium's 10,000 years of tactical doctrine and found the flaw, not through superior technology, not through military genius, through simple, elegant adaptation. They'd asked themselves what would kill them and then systematically engineered their society to survive it. It was brilliant. It was infuriating. It was exactly what humanity should have done millennia ago but never could, because the Imperium doesn't adapt. It maintains. It preserves. It clings to what worked in the past and refuses to acknowledge when circumstances have changed. The Tau did the opposite. And it saved them. But here's the part that kept that Inquisitor awake for nights afterward. The part that made her question everything she'd been taught, everything she'd believed, everything she'd killed for. The Tau had learned this capability from watching the Imperium. They'd studied how the Imperium destroyed species and reverse-engineered survival. Which meant, in some terrible ironic way, the Imperium had created its own most persistent enemy. Not through military opposition, not through political conflict, but by being so brutally efficient at extermination that any species that survived them had to be fundamentally, radically, impossibly good at not dying. The Imperium had applied such extreme evolutionary pressure that they'd bred a species specifically designed to survive Imperium-level threats. And now they couldn't destroy what they'd created. There's a conversation recorded in that Inquisitor's personal logs that she had with an ancient Magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Magos had been studying Xeno's evolutionary patterns for 900 years, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless alien civilizations, had calculated extinction probability matrices that accurately predicted species survival to within 0.03%. And when the Inquisitor asked him what the Tau's survival probability was, he gave her a number that made no sense: 112%. She thought it was an error, demanded recalculation. But the Magos insisted the number was correct. The Tau weren't just likely to survive. They were statistically destined to outlive the current probability matrix entirely. They'd become something that the galaxy's mathematical models couldn't properly account for. An anomaly. An impossibility. A species that shouldn't exist but did anyway and kept getting better at existing despite everything. The Inquisitor asked how that was possible, and the Magos explained something that made her blood run cold. The Tau weren't evolving like normal species. They were evolving like a disease. Like a virus that mutates just fast enough to stay ahead of every cure. But instead of infecting bodies, they infected ideas. Every time the Imperium deployed a new strategy against them, the Tau adapted not just to survive it, but to turn it into a lesson. Every defeat taught them. Every victory made them stronger. Every attempted extermination refined their survival capabilities. They were getting better because the Imperium kept trying to kill them. And the harder the Imperium tried, the more robust the Tau became. It was a feedback loop that couldn't be broken without either total extermination in a single overwhelming strike or complete disengagement. And both options were now impossible. That's when certain elements within the Inquisition began asking a different question entirely. Not how to destroy the Tau, not how to contain them, but what would happen if they won. If the Tau Empire, against all odds, against all probability, actually succeeded in their grand ambition. If they unified the galaxy under the greater good. If cooperation and progress actually triumphed over endless war. What would that galaxy look like? And more importantly, would humanity even survive in it? Because the Tau's philosophy has no room for the Imperium as it exists. No place for a society built on suffering and sacrifice and the belief that cruelty is necessary. The greater good doesn't compromise with different ethical systems. It welcomes all species, all cultures, all beliefs, but only if they accept the fundamental premise that cooperation benefits everyone. And the Imperium can't accept that premise without ceasing to be the Imperium. So in a galaxy ruled by the Tau, humanity would have two choices: adapt or die. Join the greater good willingly or be isolated until they collapsed under their own decay. There would be no middle ground. No coexistence between fundamentally opposed philosophies. One or the other would eventually have to give way. And that realization crystallized something that had been building in the shadows of Imperial thought for decades. The Tau weren't the Imperium's enemy, they were humanity's mirror. A reflection of what humanity could have been if they'd made different choices, if they'd chosen hope over despair, progress over stagnation, cooperation over domination. The Tau were proof that another path existed, that the Imperium's way wasn't inevitable, that 10,000 years of suffering hadn't been necessary. And that truth was more dangerous than any weapon because it undermined the very foundation of Imperial civilization. The Imperium exists because people believe it must exist, because they accept that the cruelty is necessary, that the sacrifice has meaning, that without the Emperor's guidance and the Imperium's strength, humanity would be extinguished. But if the Tau could thrive without any of that, if they could build a multi-species empire based on mutual benefit rather than mutual suffering, then what did that say about humanity's choices? What did it say about the Emperor's vision? What did it say about everything the Imperium had done and everyone who died believing it was necessary? There's no coming back from that question once it's asked. No way to unknow what's been revealed. And so the Imperium does what it always does when faced with truths it cannot accept. It buries them, classifies them, makes them secret and forbidden and dangerous to even think about. The Tau survive not because the Imperium is merciful, not because they're too strong to destroy, but because destroying them would require the Imperium to acknowledge what they represent, would require admitting that maybe, possibly, there was another way. And that admission would tear the Imperium apart faster than any external enemy ever could. So the Tau continue to exist in this strange liminal space. Too dangerous to ignore, but too useful as a cautionary tale to completely exterminate. Too weak to threaten the Imperium's existence, but too strong in their philosophy to be dismissed as irrelevant. They're Schrodinger's enemy, simultaneously on the verge of extinction and impossible to destroy. But the galaxy doesn't allow for perpetual stalemates. Something always gives. Some pressure point always cracks. And there are signs, subtle but unmistakable, that the equilibrium is breaking down. Tau expansion has accelerated in the years since the Great Rift, not militarily, but ideologically. More human worlds are accepting the greater good every year. More Imperial citizens are asking forbidden questions. More cracks are appearing in the absolute certainty that kept the Imperium functioning. And simultaneously, the Imperium is becoming more desperate, more brutal, more willing to sacrifice everything to maintain control. The Inquisition is purging entire sectors for thought crimes that wouldn't have registered as threats a century ago. The ecclesiarchy is preaching with fervor that borders on hysteria. The High Lords are making decisions that prioritize ideological purity over strategic sense. Both empires are hardening. Both are becoming more extreme versions of themselves. Both are moving toward collision because neither can tolerate what the other represents. The Tau can't accept a galaxy where the Imperium's cruelty is allowed to continue. The Imperium can't accept a galaxy where the Tau's hope is allowed to spread. And so they drift toward war. Not the small-scale conflicts that have defined their relationship, but the real war, the final war. The war that will determine which philosophy gets to define the galaxy's future. And here's the terrible truth that both sides know, but neither will say aloud. When that war comes, when they finally commit to total extermination or total conversion, there's no guarantee either side will win. The Imperium might destroy the Tau entirely, and in doing so exhaust themselves so completely that the Tyranids or Chaos or Necrons finish what remains. The Tau might actually succeed in spreading the greater good across the galaxy and discover, too late, that their philosophy wasn't built to handle the scale of suffering and horror that such expansion would require them to confront. Both outcomes end in tragedy. Both paths lead to catastrophe. And both empires are walking toward it anyway because neither can conceive of stopping. Neither can imagine a universe where their fundamental beliefs aren't vindicated. So the Tau survive, not through strength, not through luck, but through being the question that the Imperium cannot answer without destroying itself. They survive because exterminating them would mean admitting they mattered, that their challenge to imperial doctrine was legitimate enough to require such extreme response. And the Imperium cannot make that admission without validating the very philosophy they're trying to suppress. It's a trap of the Imperium's own making, a logical paradox that has no solution. And in that paradox, in that impossible space between extermination and acceptance, the Tau have found their sanctuary. They thrive in the contradiction, grow stronger in the uncertainty, become more dangerous with every day the Imperium delays their destruction. The answer to why the Tau weren't exterminated has never been simple. It's not written in battle reports or strategic assessments. It lives in the space between what the Imperium claims to be and what it actually is, between the doctrine it preaches and the reality it practices. The Tau survive because they represent something the Imperium desperately needs, but can never acknowledge. They're the proof that the Imperium's methods work. Every time the Tau adapt to an Imperial strategy, every time they survive another extermination attempt, it validates the Imperium's brutal approach. See how dangerous the galaxy is, the propagandists can say. See how even cooperation and progress barely survive. Imagine how quickly humanity would fall without the Emperor's protection, without our strength, without our willingness to do what must be done. The Tau's struggle becomes evidence for Imperial doctrine, even as their existence contradicts it. There's a scene that plays out across 1,000 worlds every day, though it's never recorded in any official capacity. An Imperial citizen, perhaps a factory worker or a merchant or a soldier on leave, asks someone older and wiser about the Tau. They've heard rumors, seen propaganda, maybe even met someone who'd encountered them. And they ask the question that's forbidden but inevitable. Why are they still alive if they're such a threat? The elder's answer varies in specifics, but is always the same in substance. Because the Emperor wills it. Because our enemies serve his purpose, even in their opposition. Because the galaxy is more complex than simple binaries of friend and enemy. It's not a satisfying answer. It's deliberately unsatisfying. But it's the only answer the Imperium can give without unraveling the certainty that holds its civilization together. The Tau survive because admitting why they need to be destroyed would be more damaging than allowing them to exist. And perhaps that's the most profound truth buried in this entire story. The Imperium is not actually a civilization built on strength. It's a civilization built on belief. On the collective acceptance that things must be the way they are. That the cruelty serves a purpose. That the sacrifice has meaning. That the Emperor's vision, 10,000 years old and barely understood, is still the only path forward. Remove that belief, introduce doubt, allow people to question whether the suffering is truly necessary, and the entire structure collapses. Not slowly, not gradually, but immediately and catastrophically. Because billions of people only endure hell when they believe heaven is impossible. The moment they suspect heaven might be real, might be achievable, might be waiting just beyond the next star system, they stop enduring. They start demanding. They start imagining. They start hoping. And hope, in a civilization built on controlled despair, is revolution. The Tau don't even have to win militarily. They've already won philosophically just by existing. Just by proving that another way is possible. Every day they survive as another day, the Imperium's absolute certainty is undermined. Every world they integrate peacefully is another crack in the foundation. Every human who defects to the greater good is another soul who chose hope over duty. And the Imperium cannot stop it without becoming the very thing that would justify stopping it. They cannot crush hope through brutality without creating more hope through their brutality. They cannot exterminate the Tau for offering an alternative without validating that the alternative was threatening enough to require extermination. It's an unwinnable war, and the Imperium knows it. So they fight anyway because not fighting would mean admitting defeat without ever testing their strength. Would mean acknowledging that some wars can't be won through force alone. There are nights in the highest spires of Terra where the oldest inquisitors sit alone with their thoughts and wonder if they've already lost. If the decision to let the Tau survive even temporarily was the moment the Imperium's fate was sealed. They run probability matrices that all end the same way. Either the Imperium exterminates the Tau and exhausts itself fighting the greater threats that surge in during the distraction, or they tolerate the Tau and watch as more and more Imperial worlds question why tolerance is possible with some Xenos, but not others. Why cooperation works for the Tau but is forbidden to humanity. Why hope is allowed to exist somewhere but not here. Both paths lead to Imperial decline. Both futures show humanity fragmented, questioning, less certain in its absolute righteousness, and perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps decline is just another word for change. Perhaps the Imperium that emerges from this slow erosion will be stronger for having questioned its assumptions. Or perhaps it will shatter entirely and something new will rise from the fragments. Something that learned from both the Imperium's strength and the Tau's adaptability. Something that could actually thrive in this nightmare galaxy instead of merely enduring it. But there's another possibility that lives in the space between these certainties. What if both empires are right? What if the Imperium's brutal methods are necessary for humanity's survival, given its specific circumstances, and the Tau's cooperation is necessary for their survival given theirs? What if there is no single correct path, no universal truth about how civilization should function? What if the galaxy is vast enough and complex enough that multiple contradictory approaches can all be valid simultaneously? That would mean the Imperium doesn't need to destroy the Tau to be right. And the Tau don't need to convert the Imperium to prove the greater good works. They can both exist, both thrive in their own ways, both serve as examples of different survival strategies in an impossible universe. It's the answer neither side wants to hear because it requires accepting that the other isn't wrong, just different. That victory doesn't mean extermination or conversion, but simply continued existence. That maybe the point isn't to prove your way is the only way, but to ensure your way survives alongside all the others. The Tau exists today because the Imperium chose not to pay the price of their extinction. That choice will define the next 1,000 years of galactic history. Already, both empires are different than they were a century ago. The Imperium is more paranoid, more brittle, more desperately clinging to certainties that no longer hold absolute sway. The Tau are more cautious, more aware of their limitations, more willing to acknowledge that the greater good isn't immediately achievable everywhere. They're learning from each other, even while claiming absolute opposition. Adapting to each other's existence, even while planning for each other's destruction. And in that mutual adaptation, in that forced evolution driven by proximity to an incompatible neighbor, both might become something neither could have predicted. Something that can survive not just each other, but everything else this galaxy throws at civilizations foolish enough to believe they have a future. There's a memorial on one of the Tau Sept worlds, erected after the Damocles Gulf campaign. It lists the names of every Tau who died in that war. Thousands of names. Each one inscribed with the same phrase: they gave their lives so that tomorrow could come. Not for victory, not for glory, not even for survival, but for the possibility of tomorrow, for the belief that the future could be better than the past. And across the galaxy, on 1,000 Imperial worlds, there are memorials with different words but the same meaning. They died so that humanity could endure, so that the species could persist, so that the Emperor's dream wouldn't fade completely into darkness. Both empires sacrificing everything for the sake of futures they'll never see. Both convinced their way is the only way. Both right and both wrong simultaneously. The question that began this story was why the Tau weren't exterminated when by every logical measure they should have been. The answer is that extinction is rarely about capability. It's about will and cost, and whether the price of destroying something is worth what you lose in the destroying. The Imperium could have ended the Tau, could still end them if they committed fully. But commitment means sacrifice, means acknowledging the Tau matter enough to warrant such expense, means validating their threat by taking it seriously. And so the Imperium chooses strategic ambiguity instead. Chooses to treat the Tau as simultaneously insignificant and existentially dangerous, as both beneath notice and requiring constant vigilance. It's contradictory. It's unsustainable. It's exactly how the Imperium has survived for 10,000 years, through embracing contradictions too vast for any rational system to contain. And maybe that's the real lesson here. That survival in Warhammer 40,000 isn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most righteous. It's about being too complicated to solve, too contradictory to fully understand, too adaptive to predict. The Tau survived by becoming a puzzle the Imperium couldn't solve without changing what the Imperium fundamentally was. They made themselves into a mirror that reflected back questions the Imperium couldn't answer. And in that space of unanswerable questions, in that gap between what should be and what is, they found something rare in this galaxy. They found tomorrow. Not guaranteed, not safe, but possible. And in a universe that runs on entropy and decay and the slow grinding down of all hope, possible is the most radical thing you can be. The Tau weren't exterminated because they made the Imperium choose between its doctrine and its survival. And when forced to choose, the Imperium discovered it valued survival more than ideological purity. That's not weakness. That's the terrible strength of pragmatism. The willingness to tolerate contradictions, because absolute purity means absolute death. And so the Tau persist, not through victory, through being the question that has no good answer, through existing in the space where certainty breaks down, through proving that in a galaxy of absolutes, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is complicated. And as long as they remain complicated, remain adaptive, remain that uncomfortable mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths, they'll continue to survive, not forever. Nothing survives forever in this universe, but for now, for tomorrow, for as many tomorrows as they can build before the galaxy's patience finally runs out.